Hello, welcome everyone to the Carsey-Wolf virtual discussion on the Korean film Parasite. I am Sowon Park. I'm originally from Korea. I now teach English literature at UCSB, and I am really excited to have Professor Kyung Hyun Kim, also originally from Korea, who now teaches at UC Irvine. He teaches East Asian Studies and Visual Studies. I'll just say a few words about Kyung Hyun's work. Kyung Hyun is a novelist. He's a producer of award-winning films such as The Housemaid, and a specialist in Korean popular culture, in particular, the global reception of the Korean wave. So Kyung Hyun, when we first conceived of this project, it was over a year ago when Parasite just won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. And we were thinking of bringing the director Bong Joon-ho to UCSB. But everything's changed since then because of COVID. But one of the things that the film was very prescient on was the kind of world in which we live, that we seem to be, what COVID has revealed is that we seem to be living in two parallel worlds where a natural disaster like COVID has no bearing on the wealthy few, whereas the abject misery of many is completely separate from the reality of the haves as opposed to the have-nots. And this was brought really, to crystal clarity in the flood scene. So I was wondering if you could begin the discussion by saying a few words about Bong Joon-ho's worldview, his prescience, and maybe his subversive critique of the global order.
I think the film has won notoriety mainly because, it speaks directly to, obviously, the economic disparity that exists between, rich and poor. There's no doubt about it. And he makes very austere and serious statements about, the growing, I think, gap between the rich and the poor, right? Neoliberalism has spared no, obviously, no one, and Koreans included. This is, and so it's one of the things to think about. Yes, it's a critique. It's a film that participates in a kind of, obviously, this kind of a prism of social critique. But at the same time, I think it's in many ways, humorous. And maybe even a cynical kind of critique. So yes, it's a critique. It's a social critique that is there. But it's something that never lets go of the power of, I think, humor, right? And the power of this kind of a satire. And so you have, and if you want to see this image that I've posted, I know screen sharing is not that great, but those of you who actually have access to that link, that is on the website, you can go on, and I have the opening shot of the film, which is basically a few launder socks, that is hanging from the ceiling, and that's the foreground. In the background is the window that opens up to the alleyway that the family, lives in, right? The Kim family lives in. And it's to be contrasted perhaps with another, window that is and that's the second image on that slideshow, if you will, of the 5-image slideshow that I've got posted up there, which will come later. It's the old window that opens up to the garden, of the backyard, the green, lush backyard of the Park family, So you got two basically windows, I think, that really speaks volumes to there's economic disparity. One only looks at, right, the alleyway and the stinky, people who are urinating. I'm assuming people have watched the movie, and you would remember, obviously, the view is not very pleasant, right, from the people who are living in what is called in Korean banjia, right? The half kind of a underground kind of a setting, residential setting that is not very, pleasant. And then to be contrast that against the window that opens up to the lush green kind of a backyard where pleasure really awaits, right? Over there, there's no stinkiness, there's no like hardship, there's no people who are drunk, who will be urinating in your, outside your bedroom. There's none of that. And so the contrast, I think, is speaks volumes to the economic disparity. But here is a humorous way in which you're, in a kind of a satire, right, satirical way in which you're gonna actually try to look at the growing disparity of the two families throughout the entire movie. And obviously, flood becomes also another microcosm in which this will be presented. And I wanted to also point out that this is a kind of a cinematic kind of ways in which the film is trying to also communicate to the audiences. In small screen, it's very difficult to get that kind of, big presentation in which you would think about and conceptualize the details of the symbolic kind of meanings, right? Associated with people are urinating, or the wet socks that is actually dripping from the ceiling. Those kind of things is very difficult to capture in a very small screen. Cinematically, it just doesn't open up. However, I think Bong Joon-ho has found a way to speak in ways that, again, do not let go of the satire or the humor. And secondly, the cinematic ways in which this speaks, captures different kind of metaphors and symbolisms. And if there's time, afterwards, I'll be happy to talk more about metaphors, because I think, metaphor is also another thing that is very interesting in Bong Joon-ho's films, especially Parasite.
Absolutely. I mean, the two things that you pointed to there, which is kind of the cynical humorous nature of things. I mean, the critique is quite savage, but it's always done in a very humane way, in ways that everybody can relate to. The thing that many people spoke about is that, yes, it is about the rich and the poor, it's about upstairs, downstairs, it's about class divide, it's about struggle, and yet there's no clear villain in the story, because one of the things that he's able to do in this film is he situates every character, every action in the very concrete texture of everyday life. And that's something that we might talk about, how situated it is in the Korean context, and yet you can watch it completely in a very different context and confer meaning into it. I say this because we had a showing in our own department, and there were lots of students, international students, who were talking about the film from their own point of view. And I was very delighted and extremely interested to see how many variations that the film yielded. So when we talk about the Koreanness of the film, which it undoubtedly is, but the global nature of this Korean language film, how do you explain the popularity or the vast way that people could relate to the film on that level?
Yeah, and as I think said a number of times, in the conversation that we've had, points to, I mean, this is not, obviously, the film begins with a familiar place, right? And I'm trying to pick on details, but the Wi-Fi poor, right? I mean, this is where the film begins. And even though I'm middle class, I'm not a stable job, and we always struggle with certain kind of bills that pile up, and one of the ways in which we try to remain afloat is, okay, we don't want to spend that much money on our Wi-Fi bills or the phone bills or the cable bills, right? and I mean, every month is almost always a struggle to balance the budget in that way, even when you do have a middle class status. And for the poor, like the Kims, who are largely unemployed, I mean, it's more of a struggle. So on a global level, you actually think about, okay, I mean, this is an issue that relates to all of us, right? The Wi-Fi poor, you know, and trying to cheat a little bit, it doesn't hurt anybody, right? You know, and also digital poor is, you know, different kind of poor than, let's say, food poor, you know, it's, I mean, starvation is real pain, right? I mean, it's one of the necessities is, you know, you need the housing, you know, you need clothing, I mean, to survive. But if you don't have internet, right? If you don't have data, it's like, yeah, you suffer because, you know, again, it's the age of information and you need that information in order to actually, right, sustain yourself. But at the same time, you don't starve to death, right? So it's a different kind of pivot that obviously Bong uses to speak, I think, to a larger audience than just Koreans, but something that is very topical and also very local, you know, because he's thinking about, in many ways, wordplay. So why pi, you know, it's phi, you know, the F sound doesn't exist in Korea, right? So it becomes a P sound, why pi, and it rhymes with choco pie, you know, right? Which is I think just a comical way in which he riddles it, why pie, you know, and choco pie, you know, is which comes up, I think, you know, one point in the movie is again, it makes it kind of a charming and localized kind of a sense of, I think, you know, global, right? Sense of, I don't know, a disparity of resources that we all are familiar with. And yeah, and just one more thing, I mean, and we can go there if you want to, I mean, and so he tries to, again, cynically or satirically approach, I think, the economic issues. And this is one of the advantages and strength, obviously, of Bong Joon-ho, where he's not thinking about subversion in a direct kind of Marxist sense, you know, of class, you know, class subversions, but more in a sense, yeah, it's Marxist in, you know, in a certain sense, but one that becomes more of a post-Marxist sensibility. So you have a negation of negation that doesn't necessarily lead to affirmation, right? But you have a constant kind of evolving of one thwarting of utopia, okay, if you will. Yes, negation of negation should lead to utopia or socialist utopia, if you will, but it doesn't get there, right? So that's the joke and the humor. Yes, you're aware of it. Capitalism sucks, and you know the filthy rich, they should lose money, you know, and poor people are just going to be as resourceful and, you know, as witty as they can be in order to actually turn the thing around, but it never gets there, right? That kind of, again, utopian imagination, you never get there quite fully, is, I think, the kind of a strength that, you know, Bong Joon-ho constantly invokes.
Yes, and in particular, in, you know, with this film, maybe not his other films, it was the kind of observation and the willingness to see many sides of a situation. It was kind of more like human comedy of Balzac, that it's a film that examines wealth and status and the obsession with wealth and status and how that divides people, but it's never done in a crude way, which leads me to another angle that was picked up on at the discussion in our department, which has to do with language. It's a curious film because this was the first film that won the Best Picture at the Academy Awards, which was not in English. I think that's right. Correct me if I'm wrong. So it's in a minor, so-called minor language, but within the film, there's a very clear linguistic hierarchy. So, you know, Nathan Park, he calls himself Nathan, and Jessica Ki Jung-shi comes out with Jessica from Illinois, and so
you have to become Jessica in order to actually become legitimate. Yes.
Yeah. So you know, the way the Mrs. Park throws in all these English words, and then the housekeeper, when she's kind of sending up the North Koreans, when she's having fun by impersonating a North Korean news presenter. So, you know, the hierarchy of language is clearly captured, but in a very subtle way. And I think this is something that many people could relate to around the world. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and to tell you the truth, I mean, this is a small, right? I may have a small complaint I have with the film, because yes, it's hierarchical, but I think, and I understand that there is an art of deception, you know, that the film is trying to invoke as one of the main themes of the movie. So I don't really know if the poor kids, you know, Kijung and Kyu, whether they speak English really well. You can never tell. Yes, they can throw out, you know, English words here and there. Whether they actually speak English well, we're not 100% sure. Although they're teachers of, obviously, I mean, Kyu especially English, right? I think the small complaint is that a family with poor resources as such, and art of deception can only work. I mean, yes, a forgery document, maybe, yes, you can get there, right? But in terms of, again, like feeding that kind of mastery of English is really, really difficult to pull off. You know, even if you're the most successful con man, you know, it's very difficult to pull off. So that was, to me, I don't know if I buy it. You know, again, having not had proper research, and you know, they can't go to school because of, obviously, they don't have tuition, blah blah blah, and yet they speak really good enough English to pull that comment job. I think it was a bit of a stretch for me. But yes, I think, you know, overall, I think you're right that the film is in many ways thinking about conceptualizing, you know, how English does have a way of hierarchizing, right, classes. Korea is no exception. But I think, you know, unlike some other countries, and I'm thinking about Frantz Fanon also, you know, like, I mean, certain post-colonial intellectuals have talked about, okay, this is master language, the French being the master language, and then, you know, you have a creolization of different kind of, obviously, you know, the so-called slave languages. I don't know if Korean ever had that kind of status of the place, because I think Koreans always had that kind of pride, if you will, when it comes to Hangul, right? The writing of Hangul, which you never had to really borrow from the alphabet, right? The romanization of the alphabet, you have your own, you know, alphabet that was there, you know, 600 years, 700 years, which is a digital language already, you know, it's a systematic language. And a lot of people still have a lot of pride with Hangul. So you, yeah, you prioritize English, but you never let go of the pride that is associated with your own local language. And it has never, unlike, you know, some of the colonial, obviously, you know, post-colonial languages that have been threatened with extinction, Hangul probably never had that threat, except, you know, very brief period of Japanese colonial era. So against English, you never had that kind of, okay, this is the slave language, opposed to, you know, English being the master language. So you can still, I'm saying this because you can still play around with code switching, okay? Because the master slave kind of dialectic is not something that is actually permanent or that is stable. And so you can play around with the power structure and the power dynamics a little bit, get around just the way in which, you know, the Hong Joon is having fun with English in Parasite, and not be, not really have your, you know, Minjuk identity, you know, like your nationalist identity be legitimized, you know, illegitimized. That's not the kind of a threat that you actually feel. Because of, again, relative stability with Hangul and the pride, again, unwavering pride Koreans associate with Hangul. Yeah.
That's a fascinating angle. And it really, I want to pick up on what you said earlier about the incredible attention to detail that he achieves in every single film, and the you see the film 3-4 times, you wouldn't really get it, but the repetitive syllables of the Korean word parasite in the characters' names, or as you said, the Wi-Fi and the choco pie, and there's so much punning, visual punning, but verbal punning in the film, which kind of I think that's something what I wanted to pick up on, but also with English as kind of the master language. I think a lot of people in America, when they watched the film, one of the interesting things about it was that it gave them a perspective of how America looks from the outside, which they hadn't quite realized before, that Illinois could signify ultimate privilege, and it would be her passport to a different kind of a world if you study at Illinois, for example. Not many people, friends in Illinois, would have this self-perception, but from Korea, things look very, very different. Another thing is that I know that a lot of people made what was translated as ramdon, the combination of the two instant noodles that Mrs. Park eats after she comes back from camping, which is japaguri in the film. And it's the contact with the world, which is very, very, very far, but also very, very near. I want to kind of hear your thoughts on that, particularly with reference to food, because there is a lot to talk about when it comes to food in the film, and food, the importance of food in Korean culture, the family, social nature of eating, and so on and so forth. So when I saw the plate of fruit that's taken to the tutor, I mean, every single Korean would recognize what that is, or having a drink at the convenience store, japaguri with sirloin steak in this case, the buffet at the driver's cafe. All these things are very, very recognizable to Koreans, but it seems to have factored in. I mean, it computes elsewhere as well. So what is the place of food in the film?
Well, I think, again, I mean, just like as you point out, in terms of language and the visual style, it points to, I think, a place where class division is being signified, as well as, I think, certain kind of notion of a threat of a family. That's which is one of the themes of the movie. But how, interestingly enough, you have the poor family that is in some ways more resourceful when it comes to food. They seem to enjoy eating. They seem to always be congregated as a family, which again in Korea you don't see much, right? Mm-hmm. Why do you think mukbang started, in Korea? Right? Because you have so much.
What that is?
Huh?
Could you explain what that is for viewers who don't?
I think kids know, who are watching this, know exactly what mukbang is. So I don't know. Everybody said basically e-cast, right? I mean, it started in Korea with live VJs basically eating, basically entire Chinese menu. Just obscene amount of food, and it became live cast, but I think more and more is also becoming more popular as a broadcast. A recorded broadcast of food eating, which then people like to associate with. Okay, I can eat vicariously, right? So you get compensated for the very small amount of food you're eating. Just looking at these people eating away, Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, I've did it a couple of times. when I'm alone, I would turn it on and I would eat just because it keeps you company, so to speak. And a lot of people I know do that, especially people who eat alone. Mm-hmm. This has become, I think, one of the symptoms of obviously social media. Not a good one, but that has a way of speaking about how isolated people have become, and family-less people have become. And so you have a poor family that is eating obviously really well, and they're having family time and they're having actual conversations, whereas the wealthy family, first of all, none of them know how to cook, right? So you have the wife who is, without a help of a maid, she's clueless how to prepare anything, not even ramen, right? So she has to have the aid of a maid, and children are spoiled, so they don't want to be part of eating process with the family, right? They have meals served to them, it seems, when they have these touring sessions. And the father also, remember when he talks about, oh, let's just, I'm by myself, but I would rather eat out. He talks about, oh, I like to eat kalbichim because my wife is such an awful cook. And the maid has just left. It's between maids, right? That period of interval. He says, oh, I don't like to go home because my wife doesn't know how to cook. And, I'd rather eat out by myself, than to face a, basically a shitty meal at home. So, you think about, obviously, yeah, they have all these resources, all this money, and yet without obviously a proper kind of, the auxiliary kind of cooks and, servers, you just don't know how to function in the kitchen. I think it's the breakdown of the family that is so, in many ways, typical of Korea's place, I think, in the world also, because it has obviously become more wealthier, and doesn't mean, they're happier, right? But in some ways it has become more precarious, and you've got obviously a situation that is not congenial in terms of family time and the meals and so on. And there's a lot more in terms of the fusion, ways in which food has become transnational and so on and so forth, but I'll stop there.
Well, so the film captures the atomization of society, but again, very consistent in all of his films. I'm thinking of Mother in particular, is that although he's really excoriating about the world in which we live, when it comes to the family, in all of his films, he seems to create this oasis of love and loyalty. So with the three families we see in the film, they treat other families as the other, but within the family, the loyalty is just never questioned. So would you disagree with that?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, because I think love is there, in fact, but it becomes really somewhere along the line really sick and perverse also, right? Mother is a prime example. I mean, you have love that is disproportionate and just it's a symptom of malady, of a sort, right? That I mean, the mother in that movie, from what I remember, is just really, really mental, right? To a point, the overprotection and the overbearing of the son. And then obviously in this movie as well, I mean, not so much of the poor family, but the rich family. I mean, the more resourceful and more time you got in your hands. I mean, the overbearing and the overparenting becomes also a malady itself, right? I mean, you're just doing way too much, and you gotta say you just gotta shut up and stop. You're actually the cause of the child's sickness. And he's gonna become mental before you know it. I mean, it's a kind of conjecture that you want to make, because she is really obviously. I'm talking about the rich, right, mother, not the poor mother. But it's almost anti-therapeutic, right? The way in which she carries on her parenting. So I mean, she's already a little psycho. I mean, to begin with. I mean, if you think about it, the moment we meet him, I mean, she's sleeping, right? She constantly is sleep deprived, which is obviously one of the ways in which Bong is trying to depict her not to be or less than normal, right?
Yes, I mean,
and there is something that is really not quite right, with that family, and it begins with the mother.
And I will just ask one more questions before taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to post questions, which is, I know that you are in contact with Bong Joon-ho and what he's been doing during lockdown, and the very specific way he creates films through storyboarding. Would you share some of the stories about his storytelling, which is very, very unusual?
Yeah, I mean, in Korea, everything is, nowadays, over the last 20 years, I mean, there's been a division of labor. So cinematography, their team does their own thing, editing, they do their own thing, production design, they do their own thing, so on and so forth. And there is what is called a professional, like a storyboarding, team that it works directly with the editing team as well as the cinematography team. So the director usually reviews and evaluates, once they're done with the script. Storyboarding in Korea is called kanti, and here is continuity. You basically produce a storyboarding book, and I believe the English version is also out. Parasite.
Yeah.
But Bong Joon-ho, even from very early days, did not outsource storyboarding to a professional storyboarder, but he drew the kanti himself, and he was famous for being very meticulous and detailed with his storyboarding, and that runs in the family, because his father. If you look at if you have access to the slide, the last one of that slide, do you see it, Sowon?
Is the Coca-Cola one?
Yeah, it's Korean graphic of Coca-Cola, and you know who did that?
Was it Pong?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. You're close. It was Bong Joon-ho's father, who was a calligrapher. He was a first generation computer or graphic artist. He was the one who did the titles in the 1960s in films.
I see.
And then he went and taught illustration and graphics. So, and he did many designs that are really famous in Korea still today. And Coca-Cola, I believe, still uses a variation of that font that Bong Joon-ho's father created, which is really cute. And, it runs that kind of artist genes, runs in the family. Obviously, he got that from, his father's side. And, his mother's side, he comes from the mother's father is Park Tae-won, who's one of the most famous novelists, who he defected to North Korea. And there's another whole story with that, being blacklisted and so on and so forth. But so from his mother, you get the literary genes, and you get from your father's side, you get the artist genes, and there you have Bong Joon-ho, making the artistic and literary, obviously products that we now know are residual in movies like Parasite and others.
Great.
So.
Now I will turn to some questions from the audience. So this is from Alberto Vasquez. Okay. I hope I got the pronunciation correct. The question is this: speaking of the hierarchy of language, what could be said about the accents of each character and their relationship to how they change social class? Well, this is with reference to the Kims, I suppose, but I suppose you could relate it to how Yeongil throws in these English words, which are sometimes very inappropriate.
Yeah, I feel the innuendos, again, of language very, very difficult to translate. And I feel it's a whole different experience watching the movie in Korean and obviously same movie, yes, but with subtitles with the English audiences here. I thought in some ways the English the one with the subtitles for the English audience has worked out in some ways better. You know, yeah, the movie did extremely well in Korea. You know, everybody was awed and really found the movie marvelous. But a lot of people actually didn't catch, because of English humor that he uses. I mean, I liked it, and I think English speaking audiences, they like it. Like, you know, the Mrs. Park saying, you know, when Jessica talks about schizophrenic kind of tendencies of the son, she goes like, yes, frinya, you know, like just like in for the Korean audience, I went and watched the movie in Korea at least twice, and nobody. I mean, I was the one only laughing because I thought it was so funny that she would like be so panicky and anxious and be like, frinya, you know, like, but nobody would be laughing at that scene because, you know, schizophrenia is not, you know, obviously within the familiar everyday idiom of a Korean language scape, right? But here, people crack up, you know, when Joy Jung, you know, the actress plays Mrs. Parks, says, "Prinya, you know, it's to capture that essence of, I mean, she is just over anxious about everything.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Now,
Go ahead.
we have a few questions on the Scholar's Stone. Many people would like to know various aspects of the Scholar's Stone. What does the stone mean to Kyu? And what does the director want to show the audience as the stone finally floats in the water?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the film is more, yes, it's about class struggle, you know, but with a twisted, again, you know, humorous, satirical angle that negation doesn't necessarily lead to this kind of a revolutionary kind of utopia. Mm-hmm. Utopia, you know, it's not that kind of affirmation that he seeks. It's more cynical than that. It just doesn't lead to anywhere. And here you have a stone, which could be used as a reference. I mean, if you think about metaphor, because that's what he says. Oh, it's a great metaphor, right? As soon as that stone or the rock appears, you got Kyu saying, yeah, wow, this is so metaphoric. And it does become a metaphor. It's a weapon of destruction or violence, or this kind of anger, right? This class anger. You know, I'm fed up with this, right? And he, you know, he doesn't have to go there, but like the stone gives him that strength, right? Stone gives him that strength to unleash that anger and that violence, because he without the stone, I don't think he would have you know, been generating that kind of, again, agency, right, to become violent. Yeah. But it's no hammer and a sickle, you see. You know, the stone, yeah, then is it hammer and a sickle, right? Like the traditional conventional way in which you understand, you know, the kind of, I don't know, revolutionary fervor or ideal. Mm-hmm. Or is it, you know, BLM sign or something like that, you know, which we know to be more of a metaphor of a, you know, this social divide and as such. It's not, you know, because Bong Joon-ho is very crafty and saying, well, yes and no, right? Again, he's thinking about metaphor only in a post-metaphoric sense, only in a post-Marxist sense, right? Well, this is because it doesn't necessarily have a clear-cut solution, clear-cut answer where negation of negation leads to affirmation of, again, revolution, right? He doesn't think that, you know? So you have that kind of, I think, equation being upset. And I think by having that kind of opaque sense of symbolism, as such, you know, the mineral stone, there you have a case of, again, Bong Joon-ho being moving away from, okay, yes, it's about how the system is messed up, and capitalism, yes, has to reset itself, but I don't know whether, there is an agency, stable agency that has a way of uncorking that, is my takeaway.
On that note, if the negation of a negation does not lead to an affirmation,
right?
Do you see that as being pessimistic or optimistic? I mean, how do you see it? Do not see it.
I mean, it's in some ways, yes. I mean, if you think about the ending of the movie, and I'm sorry to be giving away all these,
no, everyone's supposed to have watched the film before the discussion.
I'm assuming that you've all watched it. I mean, it's yeah, it's pessimistic ending, no? I mean, I felt, wow, like you're not going to win this fight against the system, okay? So forget it, right? For Q, I mean, Ki-jung's dead, like Jessica's dead, and you go, oh, that's really sad, but like he laughs it off, Remember the reaction is, Q's reaction is again like he lost it, right?
Yeah.
Again, that he's become a schizo. He becomes, I don't know. I mean, he's in delirium. Here is a classic delusion sense of now, right? Not knowing what to do, right? I mean, you got to laugh it off. I mean, you can't mourn and cry. You got to laugh it off. And then he goes to that kind of, brief fantasy sequence. Okay, I'm not going to beat the system. Then what? At least I can try to make hell of money. I'm going to make hell of money and I'm going to beat the system that way. Not going to do it through violence. Okay, it's not through the mineral stone that creates violence. I'm going to do it through, okay, I'm going to get that job, whatever, hedge my bets on Wall Street, and I'm going to win. I'm going to beat the system that way. No, right? No, even at the end, it was all a dream, right? It was a reverie. It was a utopia that was not meant to be, right? So you have an ending that is really more bitter than sweet, right? Yes, if you want to call it pessimism, then fine. This bitter, it's not sweet. I mean, from where I come from, I don't know how people understood or what the takeaway of the ending was for others, but to me it was definitely more bitter than sweet. So yes, it was depressing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, because I mean, it was so harrowing, but the fact that the boy, he clings on to the dream in order to survive it, and he's communicating through Morse code, and he has this dream that will help him endure. I mean, for me, that was kind of redemptive. So that was a little bit of hope there.
If you think about it, so I mean, he's writing a letter to the father, but that cannot be delivered, right? Yeah. He can only be on the recipient end, right?
He needs to have that in order to survive. So there is the value of
a letter that is never going to be delivered. If you think about it, I mean, if you like if you think how is he going to be delivered that letter to the father? I don't know, because he cannot see, only he can see the Morse code, through the lights, the flickering of the lights. I don't think he has a way of cracking through.
Nevertheless, they don't give up. But anyway, we have lots more questions. We have a couple that involves Jessica. I loved Jessica. She's an interesting character. And one is, what do you make of the fact that the daughter, who is always resourceful and clever, which she is the only one who ultimately dies in the Kim family? The other one is, could you address the significance of the Dodo Island ditty, the mnemonic device used by the sister? When she's ringing the bell, she has this jingle. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I was thinking about, that it's also multi-layered, right? That song, because that jingle, as you call it, or Jessica's song, that's become mimified and is part of our, it's a ringtone, and my name is Jessica. Blah, 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 blah. That where that comes from, right? Where?
Yeah, primary school.
Huh?
Isn't it primary school? Did you know, memorizing the times table?
Yes, yes. But what song is it?
Oh, I don't know what song it is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so I have to question your Koreanness now. Which is from Korea. It's 독도는 우리 땅, right?
Oh yes, this is why it's the Tokdo Island, not the Dodo Island.
Yeah, yeah. Tokdo is our island. Is the original song that it actually has been used to.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so multi-layered because it's a very nationalist, yeah, anti-Japan song. You know, you dare to claim that island off of our map, you know, you're gonna get it, right? Is a song that you learn when you're I mean, every Korean knows the song except maybe you, so.
No, I know the song, but I hadn't kind of recognized it in that ditty because you're so marvelous.
It's been turned around to actually used as a kind of a jingle in that moment. So it's got multi-layered and just like language is multi-layered, and as well as in many ways, I thought the architecture of the movie, you know, especially the house. I mean, we talked briefly about the window. I mean, it's a cinema of filtering, I feel, right? That Bong Joon-ho is creating constantly, cinema of the exhibition, because you're doing frame in a frame constantly, right? So if you go to, I don't know, 3 and 4 of the slides that I've actually posted. And 4 is, I know it's pretty dark, but it captures the two poor families, you know, fighting inside the rich people's mansion, and constantly is projecting it through a filter or through a frame, and that's what Bong Joon-ho is constantly creating. So a lot of times he's even little jingles, architecture, setting, place, people. He's constantly trying to build, obviously, multi-layers.
Yes.
And visual multi-layers is what he's constantly, again, trying to do. But going back to the part about, you know, what I thought about Ki-jung is that she again participated. I mean, she's probably is best in terms of, again, art of deception. You know, I mean, this is one thing. You know, if you don't have money, right, this is what you need to have in order to move up. You know, because you're stuck. You're dirt spoon, you know, opposed to golden spoon, and you're gonna be stuck as a dirt spoon if you don't have money. But if you have, what you can do, again, this is very cynical and obviously a sarcastic way of looking at the world. Yeah, without necessarily hoping for the utopian change or transformation. This is how can you actually theme, right? How can you actually pretend? And pretend is a word that comes up quite a bit in the movie. How can you pretend to be somebody else, right? And at least enjoy, that status for the time being, yeah? If you're never going to be ascended to that other class, if that entryway is blocked from you, right? And that class, true form of, again, class demolition or class, elevation is impossible. If those are impossible, then what can you do? If you're smart, then I think Ki-jung does hold an answer that is art of deception, right?
Yes, and we have a lot of questions. Anna Brusuti, sorry I garbled your Japanese colonialism question, but we move on to Ethan Yu, who asks, is it safe to consider this film a horror film? When I was watching it, my chest felt so tight and I was on the edge of my seat seeing what would happen next. But as you two mentioned, it doesn't seem like there's a real antagonist in this film. Is this a movie on the horror of capital or something different? This is from Ethan.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece and argued that there is kind of that Gothic element, and you're English prof, so you know this better than I do. I mean, uh, the Victorian Gothic, right, is I think a place where you got the modern horror, tales and movies, Frankenstein, and and all of that stuff that have inspired the American or the Western kind of sense of the horror. I think and in many ways, I think Jane Eyre also. I mean, I still remember, reading Jane Eyre when I was young, like age 13 or 14, and being really, really horrified, at the ending when the woman appears from the attic, right? And I thought that was going to be a happy ending, but what the hell happened with Rochester, and right? And that wife that the guy is going to get married twice now, and that's a real horror. That the sense of that mad woman from the attic, and a lot of obviously English professors and faculty. I mean, people have made careers out of talking about the post-colonial sense of the horror. It's the hidden colonies, right, that speak volumes about that kind of mad woman in the attic, kind of syndrome. Here you have the bunker and the mad man in the cellar, which is in some ways borrowed from, mad woman in the, from the attic. But you have a different, I mean, because Korea never was a, colonial power itself, I mean, if this was a Japanese movie, I think you may have a different kind of reading. Maybe Kumse, the guy who's a refugee in the bunker, may be seen as a, kind of a Joseonjin, right? The Korean, who's Japanese have been hiding, and you can do that kind of a post-colonial reading, but Korea never really participated in that kind of, right? But it did, in many ways, I mean, participate in a different kind of a horror that is, what I talked about, that did really happen to Bong's family also, because his family had to hide the fact that his grandfather, right, was a very famous novelist, was, now a national hero in North Korea, right? So you have many, they were actually punished for years. They were the guy, Bong Joon's father, couldn't be employed by a national university, although he had all the status and the, all the dossier and experience that would have made him a perfect employee at a national university. He couldn't get that job because obviously he was married to a woman who was basically a daughter of a commie, right? A very famous one at that. So they had to live, obviously, hiding the fact and concealing the fact that they were affiliated and associated with a very important communist writer for a long time. So you have a different kind of a blacklisting and a sense of I think, a real historical trauma that inspires a tale of, I think this bunker, which in many ways is, direct allegory of obviously the North Korea threat and blah, blah, blah. But you have, again, multi-layer kind of a historical sense of trauma and horror that allows that bunker to have that kind of, I don't know, allegory, if you will, or a real sense of symbolism that has a way of escaping from that real trauma, because it's too comical, but now you can actually have fun with it, genre sense of a trauma, right? Yeah. Even though that trauma of association, blacklisting, and people under the bunkers was real.
Yeah, I would just have to thank everybody. Thank you so much, Kyung Hyun, for this wonderful conversation. I would also like to thank Emily Zinn and Miguel Penabella, and also Chen Jin at East Asian Studies, who helped me conceive of the project. And so thank you all. I just want to leave on the last note of what Bong Joon-ho said when he won the Best Foreign Film at the Golden Globes. Remember this wonderful speech? He said, if you are able to overcome this 1-inch obstacle, which is the subtitle, the whole world is full of wonderful films. And on that kind of opening up sentiment, thank you very much for joining in. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.